All right, good afternoon. Tomorrow we will have a guest who I hope will be of interest to you, and that is Muhannad Hadi, our humanitarian coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory. He will be here to brief you on the situation in Gaza. This morning, the Security Council held a, oh, sorry, no, I'm not going to start with Security Council. Microphones. I will start with my boss. The Secretary General is now back in New York after attending the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, and we shared with you quite a lot of information from his trip over the weekend, including the remarks and readouts of the meetings he had there. Before leaving and speaking to reporters there, the Secretary General said that over 3 days in Addis, he had met many leaders from across the continent to discuss challenges across the spectrum, and he emphasized that despite the many tests facing Africa, we can start from a position of strength. At the same time, the Secretary General drew attention to the UN Security Council, where Africa still inexplicably lacks permanent representation, and the international financial architecture, where the power and the place of Africa is not fairly represented at the table. All of his remarks are on the interweb. This morning, the Security Council met under the agenda of threats to international peace and security. Briefing council members was Miroslav Yencha, the Assistant Secretary General for Political and Peace Building Affairs for Europe and Central Asia and the Americas. He noted that in 1 week we will mark the three tragic years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched in violation of the Charter and international law. In this context, Mr. Yencha said today's 10-year anniversary of Security Council Resolution 2202 that called for the full implementation of the now defunct Minsk agreements is an opportunity to recall that past diplomatic efforts towards de-escalation and a peaceful settlement of the conflict. He noted that the Secretary General has underlined time and time again that any peaceful settlement must respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, international law, and resolutions of the General Assembly. Mr. Yencha said that we encourage dialogue among all stakeholders and welcome all genuine efforts and initiatives with the full participation of Ukraine and the Russian Federation that would alleviate the impact of the war on civilians and de-escalate the conflict. His remarks were shared with you. And just since we're on the topic of Ukraine, our humanitarian colleagues tell us that attacks today and over the weekend in Ukraine killed and injured civilians across the country. According to what local authorities are telling us, frontline communities in Dnipro, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia were the most affected. Authorities and partners on the ground also say that yesterday a thermal power plant in Mykolaiv in the south of the country was damaged. An estimated 100,000 men, women, and children were left without heating as temperatures dropped below 0 centigrade. About 760 residential buildings and nearly 70 schools and kindergartens and 20 health facilities lost access to heating. Municipal services and are working to restore services. Meanwhile, humanitarians responded swiftly to Zaporizhzhia and Mykolaiv, providing aid, including mental health support and psychosocial support, emergency shelters, food, warm drinks, and blankets. As of this morning, the Ukraine grid operators, Ukrainegor, imposed emergency power cuts in various regions due to the latest round of attacks. As hostilities continue to damage homes and infrastructure in frontline regions, aid organizations remain committed to providing winter assistance to vulnerable people. Under the 2024-2025 Winter Response Plan, humanitarian efforts have supported more than 900,000 people. Turning to Gaza, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reports that we and our humanitarian partners continue to deliver life-saving assistance across the Gaza Strip. The scale remains overwhelming, requiring urgent and sustained support. Today, the Palestinian Ministry of Health stressed that oxygen supplies are critically needed to help emergency surgical and intensive care services running at hospitals throughout Gaza, including Al-Shifa and Al-Rantisi. Both hospitals are in Gaza City. Health partners are engaging with the authorities to bring in generators, spare parts, and equipment required to produce oxygen locally in Gaza. In northern Gaza over the weekend, shelter partners distributed tarpaulins to more than 11,000 families in need. Meanwhile, in Khan Yunis, some 450 families are receiving sealing off kits, kitchen and hygiene kits at the displacement site of Al-Mawasi. Educational activities also continue to expand. As of yesterday, our partners report that more than 250,000 learners have enrolled in UNRWA's distance learning program. Across Gaza, 95% of school buildings were damaged over the past 15 months of hostilities. That's what partners working on the education sector are telling us. Students are currently learning in makeshift tents and open spaces amid cold winter temperatures. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, OCHA says that casualties continue to be reported due to the ongoing operations by Israeli forces in Tulkarem and Jenin. OCHA warns once again that the use of lethal, warlike tactics during these operations raises concerns over the use of force that exceeds law enforcement standards. Meanwhile, settler attacks against Palestinians and their properties continue to be reported across the occupied West Bank. Over the weekend, Israeli settlers attacked residents in several villages in Nablus Governorate, in one instance setting a house on fire. Humanitarian partners are mobilizing resources to support the impacted communities. And just to note, you will have seen that yesterday and over the weekend, the Secretary General welcomed the continued implementation of the ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza and urged all parties to abide by their commitments. We remain fully engaged in supporting the implementation of the deal, including, as I've listed, through the delivery of critical humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza. The Secretary General reiterates his call for all parties to uphold international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And moving north to Lebanon, you saw that on Friday afternoon, we issued a statement in which the Secretary General strongly condemned the attack on a UNIFIL convoy near the Beirut airport, in which 2 peacekeepers from UNIFIL were injured and 1 vehicle was set ablaze. One of those people injured was our deputy force commander. And just to let you know that Major General Chok Dakal, who was ending his tour of duty, and one of his staff were injured in the attack and were taken to hospital for treatment. They were thankfully released from the hospital the following day, and yesterday Major General Dakal departed Beirut and returned home safely to Nepal. The other peacekeepers injured in the attack or involved in the attack also were able to return safely to Nakora. The government of Lebanon has opened up an investigation into the attack to bring the perpetrators to justice, a step that is clearly welcome. UNIFIL has also launched its own investigation surrounding the circumstances of the attack. We stress that the safety and the security of UN personnel and property must be respected at all times by everyone. Such attacks are in violation of international law and, of course, completely unacceptable. And moving to Syria, on the political end, I can tell you that our friend Geir Pedersen, the special envoy for Syria, will return to Damascus this week to continue his engagements with the Syrian caretaker authorities and others, including Syrians representing various factions of society. This visit follows Mr. Pedersen's participation in the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, where he held discussions with high-level representatives from Syria, France, Germany, Iraq, UAE, and other key interlocutors. He reiterated the importance of an inclusive Syrian-led political process supported by the international community. He also took part in a side event on women, peace, and security. He emphasized our call to all parties in Syria to uphold their international commitments, respect the rights and the dignity of women, and to ensure their full participation in shaping the country's future. This includes guaranteeing access to education, freedom of movement, political representation, and protection from violence and exploitation. And on the humanitarian front, today our humanitarian colleagues completed a mission to Daria in rural Damascus to visit a farm that had been cleared of explosive ordnance with the support and funding from the Syrian Humanitarian Fund. With hostilities subsiding in parts of Syria, our humanitarian partners are scaling up mine action work in newly accessible areas, including former front lines where contamination is high. Since December, a total of 138 minefields in other areas contaminated with explosives have been identified in Idlib, in Aleppo, in Hama, in Deir ez-Zor, and Latakia. During the same period, our partners have disposed of more than 1,400 unexploded ordnance items across Syria. Mine action partners continue to report casualties due to explosive ordnance, and that is happening, sadly, on an almost daily basis. Since December, over 430 deaths and injuries have been recorded. Nearly a third of them were children. Farmers and shepherds account for a significant portion of these casualties. Since January, more than 60 people have been killed and over 90 injured. These are farmers and shepherds while tending to their land or their grazing animals. Meanwhile, the flow of aid continues through border crossings. Over the weekend, 40 trucks carrying nearly 1,000 metric tons of WFP food aid, enough for over 270,000 people, crossed from Turkey to Idlib in northwest Syria through the Bab al-Hawa border crossing. Partners have also expanded the imports of food and other assistance from Jordan to Syria since the start of 2025. And our Undersecretary General for Peace Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix, will begin a visit to Sudan, South Sudan, and Abyei starting tomorrow from the 18th to 24th of this month. In Port Sudan, discussions with high-level officials from the government will focus on strengthening cooperation and coordination to support peacekeeping efforts in the Abyei region. He will then head to South Sudan, where he'll meet in Juba with government officials and other key partners to discuss ongoing operations both in South Sudan and Abyei, where we have peacekeeping operations. Discussions will include our support for the peace process, as well as assessing the region's evolving security dynamics. In both South Sudan and Sudan, he will meet with representatives of the UN on the ground. Mr. Lacroix is scheduled to be in Abyei, where he will engage with the leadership of our peacekeeping mission and meet with representatives of the Abyei administrations as well as traditional leaders. He will also engage with civil society organizations, local communities, including women's and youth groups. And just to give you a bit more of a dive in the rather depressing humanitarian situation in Sudan, which remains extremely worrying. We are especially deeply concerned about the impact of violence on civilians in and around Zamzam displacement camp in Al-Fasher, the capital of North Darfur. Following the escalation of hostilities in Zamzam over the past week, about 5,500 people were displaced and sought safety and shelter in Shamal Jabal Mara locality in central Darfur. There were also reports of others seeking to leave the area being prevented from doing so due to the intensity of the fighting and key exit routes being blocked. As you recall, Zamzam is one of the areas in Sudan where we have seen famine. This brings the total number of newly displaced people in Shamal Jabal Mara to more than 120,000, as reported by our colleagues at the International Organization for Migration. Aid agencies have provided food assistance for about 93,000 of them, and some 53,000 people have received emergency shelter and other supplies. And just another example of the importance of maintaining the safety and security of UN personnel, our peacekeeping mission in South Sudan reported that one of its Blue Helmets was injured by shrapnel in Nasir County in Upper Nile State over the weekend. This comes as UN Peacekeeping Patrol was on a pre-planned visit in the county where violent clashes have been erupting between the South Sudan People's Defense Forces and armed youth. The fighting reportedly led to civilian casualties as well as large-scale displacement. The UN mission strongly condemns the incident and is engaging with authorities and communities to restore calm. Senior personnel appointment to share with you today. The Secretary General appointed Jens Wendel of Denmark as Special Advisor on Reforms. He was previously appointed to this function from 2018 to 2020 during the implementation phase of the reforms. He has distinguished service with the UN. As you know, he served as the interim executive director of UNOPS and the SG's designate for the COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund. And he's also served as the head of the Bureau of Management at UNDP across the street. Today is Global Tourism Resilience Day. The day spotlights the importance of tourism in supporting our communities and its role in sustainable developments as it creates millions of jobs, in particular for women and young people. Take out your atlases. Oh, I see Benno is so excited. We have a quiz for you today from our guest quizmaster, David Hunter. 4 additions to the regular budget. 2 are island nations. The first island nation, I think, is the only island on which there is a UN peacekeeping force.
Cyprus?
Yes. I'm a little disappointed in you. Very good. The second is in the Pacific. It is a island state with 2 major chains of islands. One is called Ratak and the other one Ralik. No, the Marshall Islands. The third country in southern Africa is the second least densely populated country in the world. Very good. And finally, the fourth one is the birthplace of the Olympics. Georgia was still a little late on this. All right. We thank our friends in Namibia, in Greece, Cyprus, and the Marshall Islands. Madame, vous avez gagné. Yeah. Yeah.
It's open, yeah. Unless I missed it, you did not mention at all DRC. The Bukavu fell into the hands of the M23. It seemed that the African Union summit did not have any impact on stopping the offensive of the M23 and the Rwandan forces. So any comment from the Secretary General on the situation in South Kivu and the rest of the Eastern DRC?
I mean, unfortunately, I was not able to get an update in time for the briefing. We obviously continue to be very concerned about the situation in South Kivu, notably in Bukavu, which continues to impact humanitarian operations, and obviously, first and foremost, impacts the people in the civilians in Bukavu. The reports that we have is that the M23 is basically in charge and has set up an administration. You are correct in saying that this was a focus of a large part of discussions on the Secretary General's part and in his interlocutors in Addis. But we are where we are, and the bottom line is that civilians are continuing to suffer. Edie.
A follow-up on that. Does the Secretary General believe there is any prospect for talks between the M23 and Rwanda and the Congolese government? Was any progress made on that? And was any progress made in his talks in Addis on diplomacy involving both the RSF and the Sudanese government?
Look, I think none of these crises are going to be solved overnight. The Secretary General continues to push for diplomatic and negotiated solutions to all these conflicts, and not for a solution that involves more violence, more attacks, and more suffering. I think his message, which he has said publicly, is that, I mean, at least for the Eastern Congo, is that those troops that are not Congolese need to leave the Congolese territory, and that every Congolese, regardless of their ethnic background, needs to feel at home in the Congo, and their concerns need to be taken under advisement.
And on Sudan?
On Sudan, nothing. I mean, as you see, nothing very positive to report. He spoke publicly about Sudan, but I have nothing to add to what he said over the weekend.
And just to follow up on Ukraine, does the UN have any representatives in Saudi Arabia monitoring the upcoming talks between Russia and the United States, and in Paris monitoring this emergency meeting of European leaders?
No, we are not. We're obviously monitoring what is happening, but we do not have anybody in either of those places. Deji.
Yes, let me follow up with Edie's question. Also, the two meetings. Well, first of all, in the Paris emergency meeting, there is an idea of sending out military troops from the European countries floating again. What is the Secretary General's position on this issue?
Look, I think it's clear that, the reporting that we've seen is talking about sending troops in the eventuality of an agreement, right, as some peacekeeping or peace buffer. I think, obviously, all these things are a moving target. What is not a moving target is that what the Secretary General would like to see and what he's been pushing for is a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with General Assembly resolutions, in line with international law, and in line with the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
So in Saudi Arabia, the talk between U.S. and Russia will be convening, tomorrow. What is the reaction from the Secretary General that a meeting about Ukraine, there's no Ukraine in that meeting?
Look, I think I'm not going to comment on things that have not yet happened, right? I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of different developments. I think Mr. Yencha sort of addressed your question in his remarks, encouraging dialogue among all stakeholders. And as for the end product, we've stated very clearly what we would like to see.
Last question. Any conversation between the Secretary General with the Trump administration?
When that happens, you will be the third to know. Stefano.
This is a follow-up. I'm sorry, but I think you didn't answer to the elephant in the room that we have here with what's happening in Saudi Arabia tomorrow and in Paris today. Of all this, how the UN comes out of this situation where it's totally excluded, and if, let's say, will continue between the road to search for this peace will continue without including Ukraine, how the Secretary General will act? I mean, would he consider that this is under international law?
The fact remains that the UN remains very present on the Ukrainian file, notably through our humanitarian work, right? We have hundreds and hundreds of our colleagues in Ukraine, in frontline communities, helping the Ukrainian people. You have the IEA involved. You have other UN entities involved. There are a lot of moving parts, right? You're asking me what the Secretary General will say, how he will act. You're asking me to comment on something that has not yet been agreed to or happened. What I can tell you, and I've reaffirmed, is what his position is on how he would like to see the end of this conflict.
Just a quick follow-up. We understand that the power of the Secretary General, but it's like he's giving up totally on at least trying to influence what's happening in announcing that if this really happens, if they go ahead and try to find a solution, excluding Ukraine and Europe, well, at least he will say something that this is not according to what UN and the UN, what the international law expects to be done.
I think I've just answered your. I don't agree with your premise, and I feel I've answered your question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have kind of a follow-up to the Saudi Arabia. As far as I understand, the main focus will be on the possibility of the restoration of the entire range of bilateral relations between Russia and the United States, and possible meeting between the leaders of the two countries. So on that, does the Secretary General keep track of the progress of this meeting? And maybe you could share if he has any specific expectations.
Okay. You know, of course, we're keeping track of the meeting, and any dialogue between member states, any dialogue, especially between two permanent members of the Security Council, with the role that we all know they play, is critical, right? We will have to see what comes out of that meeting. Okay. On that note, enjoy the day.